Picture this: a battlefield shrouded in mist, where the banners of bitter enemies flutter side by side. Knights who once crossed swords now stand shoulder to shoulder, bound by an agreement no one saw coming. This wasn't just a scene from a storybook. It was the reality of medieval Europe, where the unthinkable became possible. Rivals turned allies, not out of trust, but because the stakes were too high to ignore. These weren't just fleeting handshakes. They were calculated moves that shifted the balance of power, redrawing borders and rewriting destinies. And what makes these alliances so fascinating isn't just the drama. It's how they reveal the razor's edge between survival and ruin, where even the fiercest foes could find common ground when history demanded it. Think about the last time you had to work with someone you didn't quite see eye to eye with. Maybe it was a co-worker, a neighbor, or even a family member. Now, imagine that tension magnified 1,000-fold: kings and queens, entire nations, putting aside generations of bloodshed because the alternative was unthinkable. That's the power of these medieval alliances. They weren't about friendship, they were about strategy, survival, and sometimes sheer desperation. From the Holy Roman Empire to the Byzantine courts, the medieval world was a chessboard, and these unexpected partnerships were the moves that changed the game forever. So why do these centuries-old pacts still matter today? Because they're a masterclass in human ingenuity. They show us that even in the darkest times, diplomacy could triumph over division, that enemies could become, if not friends, then necessary partners. Over the next 24 stories, you'll see how rival kings buried their grudges to face a greater threat, how religious factions set aside dogma for the sake of survival, and how these uneasy alliances didn't just shape the past, they laid the groundwork for the Europe we know now. This isn't just history, it's a testament to the unpredictable, often breathtaking ways humanity navigates crisis. And trust me, by the end, you'll never look at medieval Europe the same way again. To truly grasp how extraordinary these medieval alliances were, we need to step into the mindset of the time. This was an era where a handshake wasn't enough, where trust was so fragile that kingdoms demanded guarantees written in blood, gold, and vows. Imagine a world without international law, where the only thing binding two rulers was their word, often given under the watchful eyes of clergy or the threat of divine punishment. These weren't just political maneuvers, they were high-stakes gambles where betrayal could mean annihilation. Take royal marriages, for example. Today, we might see them as fairy-tale unions, but in medieval Europe, they were strategic masterstrokes. A single wedding could end decades of war, weaving together rival dynasties like threads in a tapestry. But even then, nothing was simple. A bride sent to forge peace might carry her father's ambitions with her, turning her new home into a battleground of subtle influence. And let's not forget the hostages noble children exchanged as living collateral, raised in the courts of their families' enemies, walking reminders that broken promises had consequences. Then there were the oaths. In an age where faith shaped every aspect of life, swearing on relics or sacred texts wasn't just ceremonial, it was believed to bind the soul. A king who broke such an oath risked not only his reputation but his salvation. Yet, even these solemn vows were sometimes cast aside when power hung in the balance. That's what makes these alliances so gripping. They existed in the gray space between honor and survival, where necessity often trumped tradition. And let's not overlook the sheer audacity of some of these partnerships. Picture a Crusader king joining forces with a Muslim emir against a common foe, or rival Italian city-states setting aside their vendettas to face an invading army. These weren't just temporary truces, They were seismic shifts in loyalty that reshaped entire regions. The medieval world thrived on contradictions, where yesterday's enemy could become tomorrow's ally, not out of affection, but because the alternative was unthinkable. This backdrop of uncertainty is what makes the alliances we're about to explore so remarkable. They weren't forged in boardrooms or sealed with sterile documents. They were born in the heat of crisis, often brokered by rulers who had to choose between swallowing their pride or facing destruction. Every hand extended across enemy lines carried the weight of history, and every one of them changed the course of Europe in ways we're still unraveling today. The year was 753, and the Italian peninsula was a chessboard of shifting loyalties. On one side stood the Byzantines, heirs to Rome's Eastern legacy, stretching their influence westward. On the other, the Lombards, fierce, ambitious, and hungry for territory. And then there were the Franks, led by Pepin the Short, a king whose very nickname hid a towering legacy in the making. Just decades earlier, his father Charles Martel had crushed the Lombards at the Battle of Pavia. Now, in a twist that would have shocked their ancestors, Frankish and Lombard banners flew together. What could possibly make former enemies clasp hands? The answer lay in Constantinople's shadow. The Byzantines had been quietly tightening their grip on Italy, and neither Pepin nor the Lombard king Aistulf could afford to let that stand. So they did the unthinkable. They turned marriage into a weapon. Pepin's sister, a princess of the Franks, became the bride of Aistulf's brother, a living treaty stitched with thread of gold and steel. Overnight, rivals became kin, and Italy's balance of power tilted. But here's where it gets fascinating. This wasn't just about land or armies, it was about legitimacy. The Lombards had long been seen as barbarian outsiders, while the Franks craved the prestige of Rome's mantle. By allying, they crafted something new, a coalition that could challenge Byzantine authority without appearing as mere warlords. And when Pepin later marched into Italy at the Pope's plea, it wasn't just a Frankish army that crossed the Alps, it was a coalition forged in that unlikely marriage, proving that even the bloodiest grudges could be buried when empires were at stake. The ripple effects were staggering. This alliance didn't just secure Pepin's southern flank, it laid the foundation for his son Charlemagne's imperial coronation decades later. Think about that, a Lombard-Frankish pact born of cold calculation indirectly birthed the Holy Roman Empire. It's a reminder that in medieval politics, today's enemy might be tomorrow's in-law, and the sharpest swords could sometimes be sheathed by the deftest diplomacy. Yet the real lesson here isn't just in the alliance itself, but in its fragility. Within years, Aistulf would break the peace, prompting Pepin to invade. Even the strongest pacts could crumble when ambition flared, but for that brief, pivotal moment, two kingdoms had rewritten the rules. They proved that in the Game of Thrones, bloodlines could be stronger than battle lines, and that sometimes the most enduring victories began not on the battlefield, but at the altar. Northumbria was burning. The year was 865, and the kingdom that had once been England's brightest beacon of learning and power now teetered on the edge of collapse. But this wasn't just another Viking raid, this was something far more unexpected. The Great Heathen Army, a force of Norse warriors that had swept across Britain like a storm, did something no one saw coming. They didn't just fight the Anglo-Saxons, they fought alongside them. At the heart of this unlikely pact was a king who'd grown too cruel for even his own people to bear. Osbert of Northumbria had ruled with such brutality that his nobles were willing to do the unthinkable, reach out to the very invaders ravaging their lands. Imagine the scene: Saxon thanes, their cloaks pinned with crosses, sitting across from Viking jarls adorned with Thor's hammers, negotiating over mead and steel. Their agreement was simple: overthrow Osbert, and in return the Vikings would get land, silver, and a foothold in England that would last generations. What followed wasn't just a change of rulers, it was a seismic shift in England's destiny. The alliance succeeded, Osbert fell, and the Vikings installed a puppet king. But the real shock came after. Instead of pillaging and moving on, the Norse settlers stayed, weaving themselves into the fabric of Anglo-Saxon life. They married local women, adopted Christian customs alongside their own gods, and established the Danelaw, a vast territory where Viking law held sway. This wasn't mere occupation, it was cultural fusion on an unprecedented scale. Think about that for a moment. Legal disputes in the Danelaw were settled by mixed juries of Saxons and Norsemen. Towns like York became bustling hubs where Old Norse and Old English blended into a common tongue. Even today, English speakers unknowingly use Viking words every day: sky, law, egg, all linguistic heirlooms from this uneasy partnership. The Danelaw proved that conquest didn't have to mean annihilation sometimes, it could mean transformation. Yet the most striking lesson here isn't about swords or treaties, it's about the power of shared grievances. The Northumbrian nobles didn't ally with Vikings because they trusted them. They did it because Osbert had left them no other choice. Oppression, it turns out, could make even the bitterest enemies into temporary allies. And while the Danelaw would eventually fall to Saxon kings like Alfred the Great, its legacy endured in England's laws, its language, and its very identity, proof that history isn't always written by the purest victors, but sometimes by the most pragmatic survivors. Constantinople's golden gates creaked open in the spring of 1097, revealing a sight that would have been unimaginable just years earlier. Emperor Alexios Komnenos, ruler of the Byzantine Empire, stood face to face with an army of Frankish, Norman, and Flemish knights, men his people had long dismissed as barbarians. These were the warriors of the First Crusade, answering Pope Urban's call to reclaim Jerusalem. But here's the twist: Alexios hadn't invited them to save his empire. He'd begged them to save it from itself. The emperor's dilemma was staggering. The Seljuk Turks had sliced through Byzantine Anatolia, turning cities that had stood for centuries into smoking ruins. Alexios needed soldiers, but the very Crusaders who could turn the tide also terrified him. These weren't disciplined Byzantine troops. They were volatile warlords like Bohemond of Taranto, whose father had once tried to conquer Constantinople. Trusting them was like handing a lit torch to an arsonist and praying they'd only burn your enemies. Yet necessity forced Alexios's hand. In a masterstroke of political theater, he demanded each Crusader leader swear an oath of fealty, an unthinkable demand for proud European nobles. They'd return any conquered lands to Byzantium, effectively making them the emperor's mercenaries. The air in the great palace must have crackled with tension as Bohemond, Godfrey of Bouillon, and others reluctantly knelt. This wasn't an alliance built on trust. It was a marriage of convenience with divorce papers already drafted, and for a time it worked spectacularly. The combined Byzantine Crusader forces smashed through Seljuk defenses at Nicaea and Dorylaeum, victories that would have been impossible alone. Byzantine gold funded the campaign, while Crusader ferocity broke Turkish lines. But beneath the surface, resentment festered. When Antioch fell after a grueling siege in 1098, Bohemond immediately betrayed his oath, keeping the city for himself. Alexios, marching to reinforce them, turned back upon hearing of the treachery, a decision that would echo through history. This rift reveals the fatal flaw in their pact. Neither side truly understood the other's motives. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as hired blades to reclaim lost territory. The Crusaders saw themselves as holy warriors answerable only to God. When their paths diverged at Antioch, the illusion of unity shattered. Yet without this fragile coalition, the Crusaders might never have reached Jerusalem, and Byzantium could have collapsed entirely under Turkish pressure. The bitter irony, this short-term success planted the seeds for Constantinople's nightmare a century later. The Fourth Crusade's sack of 1204 wasn't just random violence. It was the explosive endpoint of decades of mutual suspicion that began with Alexios's wary handshake. Alliances, even victorious ones, carry hidden costs. Sometimes the price isn't paid by those who make the deal, but by their heirs left holding the pieces. The sun-scorched cliffs of Syria concealed one of history's most improbable meetings. In the late 12th century, a Templar knight cloaked not in his order's iconic white mantle, but in the rough garb of a merchant picked his way up a narrow mountain path. His destination, the Eagle's Nest fortress of Alamat, stronghold of the Hashashin, the legendary assassins. These were the sworn enemies of Christendom, the shadowy sect whose dagger strikes could topple kings. Yet here they were, not crossing blades but sharing secrets. What could possibly drive these ideological opposites into each other's arms? The answer loomed over them both: Saladin. The brilliant Muslim commander had united Egypt and Syria, his armies threatening both Crusader states and the Assassins' mountain redoubts. The Templars needed intelligence on Saladin's movements. The Assassins wanted protection from his expansion. And so, in the flickering torchlight of Alamat's inner chambers, a silent bargain was struck. Gold changed hands, yes, but far more valuable were the whispered warnings of troop movements, the coded maps of supply routes. This wasn't friendship, it was cold, calculated pragmatism. The Templars, who publicly vowed to exterminate infidels, now relied on Muslim assassins for survival. The Hashashin, who'd made martyrs of countless Christians, suddenly found Crusaders useful shields against a greater threat. Their communication was a masterpiece of medieval espionage. Messages hidden in prayer scrolls, informants posing as pilgrims, even the occasional gift of horses, whose saddlebags just happened to conceal strategic reports. The most fascinating part, both sides kept their hands clean. When a Templar needed to send a sensitive reply, he'd accidentally lose a sealed letter during a skirmish with assassin scouts. The Hashashin, for their part, would let Crusader patrols discover crucial intelligence in abandoned camps. This dance of deniability allowed both orders to maintain their public hatred while reaping private benefits. Yet, like all such arrangements, the alliance had limits. The moment Saladin's pressure eased, old hostilities resurfaced. By the 1290s, Templar records speak of the Serpent's Brood once more as enemies. But for those critical decades, these mortal foes proved something profound, that in the chess game of medieval geopolitics, even the black and white pieces could sometimes move together, if only to checkmate a shared threat. Their legacy isn't in lasting trust, but in the sheer audacity of their temporary collusion, a reminder that survival often writes stranger scripts than ideology. The snow-covered steppes of Central Asia seemed worlds away from the marble halls of the Vatican, yet in 1245, a Franciscan friar named Giovanni da Pian del Carpine found himself kneeling before the most feared ruler on earth, Guyuk Khan, grandson of Genghis. The Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to Hungary, an unstoppable force that had crushed kingdoms like twigs underfoot. And now, astonishingly, Pope Innocent Roman IV was proposing they join Christendom as allies against Islam. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was a high-stakes gamble that defied every medieval stereotype. The Mongols were the ultimate other, branded as devils in European chronicles for their sack of cities like Kiev and their infamous horse archer tactics. Yet here was the Vicar of Christ himself, offering friendship to these very conquerors. Why? Because geopolitics had a way of rewriting the rules. The Mamluks in Egypt and the Seljuks in Anatolia were growing stronger, threatening both Crusader outposts and Mongol ambitions. Suddenly, shared enemies made for strange potential bedfellows. Guyuk's response to the Pope's overture was as revealing as the proposal itself. His letter, preserved in the Vatican archives, didn't reject the idea outright. Instead, he demanded submission. "You should come in person at the head of all your kings," he wrote, "to serve us." It was a breathtaking power play, casting the Pope not as an equal but as a vassal. Yet buried in that arrogance was a kernel of possibility. The Mongols had already shown flexibility with religion, employing Nestorian Christian advisors and tolerating diverse faiths across their empire. Had negotiations been handled differently, might history have taken another path? The missed opportunity becomes even more tantalizing when you consider the Mongols' later alliances. Just decades after Guyuk's death, his cousin Hulagu would sack Baghdad with the help of Armenian and Georgian Christian troops, then forge pacts with Crusader states against the Mamluks. The pieces were there for a grand Christian-Mongol coalition, but mutual suspicion and cultural clashes kept them scattered. Imagine an alternate timeline where papal envoys and Mongol khans had hammered out a true military pact. Crusader knights fighting alongside Mongol Tumans could have reshaped the entire eastern Mediterranean, potentially halting the Mamluk rise that ultimately erased the last Crusader strongholds. Jerusalem itself might have become a joint protectorate rather than slipping entirely from Christian grasp. Yet the real lesson here isn't about what might have been. It's about how even the most rigid medieval worldviews could bend under strategic pressure. When survival was at stake, labels like pagan or barbarian suddenly mattered less than the cold calculus of power. This near alliance proves that in the chess game of empires, ideology was never the only player at the board, and sometimes the most consequential moves were the ones left unmade. The winds howling through the Scottish Highlands in 1295 carried more than winter's bite, they carried the whispers of a rebellion taking shape. King John Balliol, his crown buckling under English pressure, faced an impossible choice: submit to Edward Longshank's domination or gamble on an alliance with a power across the sea. That gamble became the Old Alliance, a pact so enduring it would outlast dynasties, shape battles, and even influence what Scots drank with their supper. At first glance, the pairing seemed improbable. Scotland, a land of clans and craggy fortresses, and France, the glittering heart of medieval chivalry, shared no border, no language, not even a common past. What they did share was an enemy, England's growing hunger for territory. The treaty's terms were straightforward. If England attacked either nation, the other would invade English soil. It was a classic pincer strategy, forcing Edward to fight on two fronts. But what began as cold strategy soon warmed into something far richer. Take the year 1429, when a Scottish army marched not just for France, but for a legend. Joan of Arc's divine mission to crown Charles Roman VII found unlikely champions in men like John Stuart, Earl of Buchan, who led thousands of Scots at her side. Their victory at Patay wasn't just a military triumph, it proved the alliance had evolved beyond parchment promises. These weren't mercenaries, they were believers in a shared cause, fighting under banners that bore both the fleur-de-lis and the lion rampant. Yet the Old Alliance's true genius lay in its economic threads. While swords clashed on battlefields, Scottish ports like Leith and Aberdeen brimmed with French wine imported duty-free as part of the treaty. In return, French tables groaned under Scottish salted salmon and wool. This wasn't just trade, it was interdependence woven so tightly that when the Reformation split Europe, Catholic France kept shipping wine to Protestant Scotland. turning a blind eye to theology for the sake of tradition and profit. The alliance's twilight came with a bittersweet irony. In 1558, young Mary, Queen of Scots, sailed to France as a bride-to-be. Her marriage to the Dauphin meant to cement the bond forever. Instead, her tragic return as a widow marked the beginning of the end. Protestant England's rise and France's own religious wars strained old loyalties until finally, in 1560, the Treaty of Edinburgh dissolved the alliance that had lasted longer than some empires. But here's what's remarkable: its ghost lingered. Centuries later, during the Napoleonic Wars, Scottish regiments in British service would still toast the old alliance before charging French troops. The cultural imprint ran deep. Scotland's legal system kept traces of French influence, and that wine trade, it never fully stopped. The old alliance proved that some partnerships, forged in the fires of necessity, could cool into something resembling friendship, or at least a mutual appreciation between two peoples who once stood together against the world. The Baltic Sea in the 14th century wasn't just a body of water. It was a battleground of ledgers and tariffs, where fortunes rose and fell not by the sword, but by the stroke of a merchant's pen. At the heart of this quiet revolution stood the Hanseatic League, a sprawling network of German trading cities that turned commerce into an empire without borders. But their most surprising move, allying with Scandinavian kings who should have been their rivals. Picture the scene: a Danish monarch, his treasury drained by endless wars, staring at ledgers that promised ruin. Enter the Hanseatic merchants, their ships heavy with Flemish cloth and Russian furs, offering a lifeline. The deal was simple: exclusive trading rights in exchange for loans, naval support, and a seat at the political table. For cash-strapped Scandinavian rulers, it was an offer they couldn't refuse. The Hanseatic League didn't just sell goods, they sold stability, propping up kingdoms that might have collapsed under their own debts. Take King Magnus of Sweden, who in 1350 signed a treaty granting Hanseatic merchants duty-free access to his ports. In return, they financed his wars against rebellious nobles, a masterstroke that kept him in power while filling their coffers. This wasn't charity, it was cold-eyed strategy. The League's ships became floating fortresses, their cargo holds stuffed with silver that could bankroll an army or topple a throne. When Danish kings tried to tax their trade, the merchants simply blockaded ports until the crown capitulated. No need for siege engines when a ledger could starve a kingdom into submission. The real brilliance of these alliances lay in their flexibility. Unlike feudal oaths bound by land and lineage, Hanseatic partnerships were purely transactional. Need to shift allegiance from a weakening Norwegian king to his upstart rival. A few promissory notes settled the matter. This fluidity terrified traditional monarchies. The League proved that loyalty could be bought and sold like Baltic herring, upending the medieval world's rigid hierarchies. Yet for all their power, the Hanseatic merchants were careful never to crown a king. They preferred puppets to princes, knowing that a ruler in their debt was more useful than one on their throne. Their influence seeped into every facet of Scandinavian life, from the German-style brick buildings rising in Stockholm to the laws protecting foreign merchants in Bergen. Even the fish on a Norwegian peasant's plate might have passed through Hanseatic hands first. The League's decline came not from war, but from the very thing that built it, changing trade winds. As Dutch and English ships mastered Atlantic routes, the Baltic lost its monopoly, but the lesson endured that in the right hands, gold could wield more influence than any crown. The Hanseatic League didn't just move goods, it moved the course of history, proving that sometimes the mightiest alliances aren't sealed with a kiss on a royal ring, but with the clink of coins in a merchant's strongbox. The forests of Bohemia echoed with hymns in the 1520s. But these weren't the Latin chants of Rome, they were the defiant songs of Hussite rebels, singing in their own tongue as they prepared for battle. These followers of Jan Hus, burned as a heretic a century earlier, had turned their homeland into a fortress of radical reform. Yet their most surprising shield didn't come from fellow reformers. It came from Catholic Poland, a kingdom that should have been their enemy. King W. Ladislaw Roman III advisors must have clutched their rosaries in horror when the proposal first reached Krakow. Allying with heretics, the Hussites rejected papal authority, served communion with bread and wine for all, and had even smashed altars across Bohemia. But politics, as always, had a way of bending principles. The Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, who also happened to be the deceased Hus's executioner, was massing armies to crush the rebellion, and his ambitions didn't stop at Bohemia's borders. Poland, still licking its wounds from wars with the Teutonic Knights, couldn't risk an emboldened emperor on its doorstep, so the unthinkable happened. Polish envoys slipped into Hussite strongholds like Tabor, where they found battle-hardened warriors who'd invented war wagons, rolling fortresses that could transform any field into a killing ground. The deal they struck was pure pragmatism. Polish grain would feed Hussite armies, while Hussite veterans would train Polish troops in their revolutionary tactics. In return, Poland's diplomats would block church efforts to rally all Europe against the rebels. The alliance's impact was immediate. When Sigismund's Crusaders marched into Bohemia in 1426, they expected to crush peasants. Instead, they faced a disciplined force bolstered by Polish supplies and intelligence. The Hussites' famous general, Jan Žižka, even sent commanders north to advise Poland's defenses. For nearly 2 decades, this unholy partnership kept Bohemia just out of Rome's grasp, a staggering achievement for a movement that should have been annihilated within years. But here's what's truly fascinating. The cultural exchange ran deeper than battle plans. Polish scholars began quietly importing Hussite texts, their margins filled with radical ideas about church reform. Some historians argue these whispers of dissent laid groundwork for Poland's later reputation as Europe's most tolerant kingdom, where Protestants, Jews, and Orthodox Christians found refuge while the rest of the continent burned heretics. The alliance's end came not from betrayal but from exhaustion. By the 1430s, moderate Hussites sought reconciliation with Rome, and Poland turned its gaze toward Ottoman threats in the south. Yet its legacy endured in the unlikeliest places, like the war wagons that later appeared in Polish armies, or the Bohemian-style chalices that secretly circulated in Polish villages long after Hussite fires were extinguished. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience, it was proof that even the deepest religious divides could bend, however briefly, when survival hung in the balance. And in bending, they left cracks through which new light could shine. The forests of Prussia in 1382 witnessed something extraordinary. Teutonic knights, those white-clad warriors of the cross who had spent a century baptizing pagans with steel, sitting down to break bread with their sworn enemies. Not just any pagans, but the Lithuanians, the last major European kingdom holding fast to its old gods. The same warriors who once boasted of hanging pagan prisoners from sacred oaks now signed treaties guaranteeing safe passage for Lithuanian merchants through their lands. What could possibly make these holy warriors set aside their crusading fervor? The answer lies not in scripture but in ledgers and the rising power of a common rival, Poland. For the Teutonic Order, this pivot was nothing short of revolutionary. Their entire existence was built on the premise of holy war against Baltic pagans, a mission that had drawn knights from across Europe to fight under their Black Cross. Donations from pious nobles, land, silver, even entire villages flowed in as long as they kept up the righteous struggle. Yet by the late 14th century, the math had changed. Lithuania's Grand Duke Jogaila was no fool. He understood that his kingdom's survival depended on playing both sides. He allowed the Teutonic knights to stage occasional raids, spectacles of conversion that kept their European backers happy, while secretly ensuring these attacks never threatened his core lands. Behind the scenes, Lithuanian amber, furs, and grain moved freely along Teutonic-controlled rivers, filling both sides' coffers. The real turning point came when Jogaila made his own shocking alliance, marrying the young Queen of Poland in 1386 and converting his realm to Christianity overnight. Suddenly, the Teutonic Knights' entire justification for war evaporated. Their greatest pagan enemy was now a baptized king, and worse, he was merging his kingdom with Poland, creating a juggernaut that could crush the order between its jaws. The Knights' response, a masterclass in realpolitik. They pivoted from calling Jogaila a heathen to branding him a fake Christian, while simultaneously deepening their economic ties with his cousin Vytautas, who ruled Lithuania's eastern lands. Here's where it gets deliciously ironic. Vytautas, though now nominally Christian, still tolerated pagan practices among his subjects, and the Teutonic Knights, who had spent generations crusading against such heresy, now turned a blind eye. Why? Because Vytautas controlled the trade routes to the Black Sea, where Lithuanian goods could bypass Polish tolls and reach Genoese merchants in Crimea. The Order's commanders, once content with plunder, now craved a cut of this lucrative commerce. They even allowed Vytautas to use their castles as staging grounds for his campaigns against the Tatars, another former enemy turned temporary ally. The ultimate proof of this unholy alliance came at the Battle of Grunwald in 1410, where Teutonic and Lithuanian forces clashed in one of medieval Europe's bloodiest conflicts. Yet just years earlier, those same Lithuanian warriors had fought alongside the Order against Polish-backed rivals. Such was the fluidity of medieval politics, where today's battlefield foe could be tomorrow's business partner, and where even the most zealous crusaders learned that when gold spoke, dogma often fell silent. What makes this alliance so revealing is its aftermath. The Teutonic Order never fully recovered from Grunwald, their military power broken and their moral authority in tatters. Yet their brief partnership with pagan Lithuania left an unexpected legacy. The very trade networks they helped foster became the arteries of a new Baltic economy, one where profit, not piety, dictated alliances. The Knights had set out to conquer souls, but in the end they proved something far more pragmatic, that even the holiest wars could end with a handshake and a shared ledger. The court of France in 1420 should have been a place of unity, the kingdom locked in a life or death struggle with England during the 100 Years' War. Instead, it became the stage for one of history's most shocking betrayals. There, in the shadow of the mad King Charles VI, stood Duke John the Fearless of Burgundy, his crimson cloak a silent challenge to the royal blue of France. His crime wasn't just disloyalty, it was a calculated move to dismantle the very kingdom his family had sworn to protect. Burgundy's rise had been meteoric. Through strategic marriages and shrewd politicking, the dukes carved out a realm stretching from the Low Countries to the Swiss Alps, richer in some years than the French crown itself. But wealth wasn't enough. When John the Fearless ordered the assassination of his rival, the king's brother Louis of Orleans, in 1407, he crossed a line even medieval politics seldom broached. The act sparked civil war between Burgundians and Armagnacs, France's pro-royal faction, just as England's Henry V prepared to invade. Here's where the betrayal reaches Shakespearean proportions. In 1419, with Henry's armies rampaging through Normandy, Burgundy's new Duke Philip the Good made his play. Instead of rallying to his king, he invited the English to a secret summit on a bridge at Montereau. The terms were staggering. Burgundy would recognize Henry as France's rightful ruler in exchange for keeping its vast territories independent. For Henry, it was a golden opportunity. With Burgundy's support, he could isolate Paris and force the French crown's surrender. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within months, Henry married Charles VI's daughter, was declared heir to the French throne, and left the legitimate Dauphin, the future Charles VII, stranded in the south with only a rump court. Burgundian troops, who should have been France's defenders, now guarded English supply lines. Paris, starved and terrified, opened its gates to the invaders. By 1422, it seemed France itself might vanish from the map, partitioned between England and Burgundy. Yet the cruelest twist came later. When Henry V died unexpectedly in 1422, leaving an infant son as king of both realms, Burgundy's calculus shifted. Supporting a weak child king in London was riskier than dealing with a resurgent Charles VII, especially as Joan of Arc's victories began rallying French morale. In 1435, Philip the Good did the unthinkable again. He abandoned the English and reconciled with Charles. This wasn't repentance, it was another cold gamble. The Treaty of Arras granted Burgundy near total autonomy, exempting it from royal taxes and granting Philip rights no other French noble possessed. The duchy had played both sides masterfully, emerging stronger despite betraying each in turn. The lesson here isn't just about treachery, it's about medieval power's fluid nature. Loyalty wasn't to nations, but to dynasties and personal gain. Burgundy's dukes saw their lands not as part of France, but as a chessboard where kings were just another piece to manipulate. And for a few pivotal decades, their moves nearly checkmated a kingdom. Rome in the year 1059 was a city under siege, not by foreign armies, but by its own contradictions. The papacy, still reeling from the great schism that had split Christendom, faced an impossible choice: continue fighting the Normans rampaging through southern Italy, or embrace these very raiders as saviors. It was a decision that would reshape the Mediterranean world, proving that even the most unlikely allies could rewrite history when survival was at stake. Just decades earlier, Norman mercenaries had been the nightmare of Italian monasteries. Descendants of Vikings who'd carved out a kingdom in northern France, they arrived in Italy as hired swords, only to turn on their employers and seize lands for themselves. Chroniclers called them a race of surpassing ferocity, a men who thought nothing of sacking churches or extorting gold from bishops. Yet when Pope Leo IX marched against them at Civitate in 1053, the Normans didn't just win the battle, they captured the Pope himself, holding him prisoner for months in what should have been an unforgivable sacrilege. But politics, like the shifting sands of the Mezzogiorno, had a way of upending expectations. By 1059, a new Pope, Nicholas II, faced a crisis that made Norman aggression look like a minor nuisance. The Holy Roman Emperor and the Byzantine Empire were both maneuvering to control the papacy, while Roman nobles plotted against him within the city walls. Desperate for military muscle, Nicholas did the unthinkable. He invited the Norman leader Robert Guiscard, the same man who'd once robbed pilgrim caravans, to swear fealty as defender of the faith. The deal they struck at Melfi was revolutionary. In exchange for papal recognition of their conquests, the Normans would expel the Byzantines from Italy and protect the church's interests. Guiscard, a cunning strategist, understood the power of legitimacy. His ancestors had been landless adventurers. Now, with the Pope's blessing, he could style himself Duke of Apulia and Calabria and rule as God's anointed. For Nicholas, the benefits were even clearer. With Norman knights guarding papal lands, he could finally stand up to emperors and scheming cardinals alike. The alliance's first test came in 1084, when Robert Guiscard marched on Rome itself, not as a conqueror, but as the Pope's champion. Emperor Henry IV had installed an antipope, and the rightful pontiff, Gregory VII, was trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo, his pleas for help ignored by every other Christian ruler. Only the Normans answered. Guiscard's troops smashed through the city gates, drove Henry's forces north, and rescued Gregory, though their liberation left much of Rome in flames, a reminder that these were still mercenaries at heart. What makes this partnership so fascinating isn't just its success, but its contradictions. The same Normans who protected popes also looted Byzantine churches in Sicily, melting down sacred vessels for bullion. They staffed their courts with Muslim scholars while crusading against Islam in the Holy Land. And when Guiscard's son Bohemond joined the First Crusade, he did so with papal approval despite having once besieged a pope's castle. The legacy of this unholy alliance endures in the stones of southern Italy's cathedrals, where Norman Romanesque arches frame Byzantine mosaics, and in the Vatican's playbook of realpolitik. It proved that in medieval Europe, even the fiercest wolves could be leashed if you were willing to feed them enough territory. More importantly, it showed that sometimes the surest defenders of faith weren't saints, but savvy warriors who knew the price of a papal banner. Granada's crimson banners should have been Castile's target, yet in 1340, King Alfonso XI found himself exchanging secret letters with the Emir Yusuf I, ruler of Islam's last stronghold in Iberia. Publicly, both men played their parts in the endless Reconquista pageant, Alfonso launching raids to please his bishops, Yusuf proclaiming holy war to satisfy his imams. But behind the palace walls, a different game unfolded. Their shared enemy, the Marinids of North Africa, whose galleys threatened both Granada's independence and Castile's southern ports. This shadow alliance reveals medieval Iberia's true complexity. While chroniclers wrote of an eternal clash between cross and crescent, rulers knew the truth faith mattered less than footholds. When Yusuf's spies warned of Marinid ships massing near Gibraltar, he didn't just alert his own navy. He sent coded messages to Seville, where Castilian shipwrights quietly diverted timber meant for crusading galleys to Granada's docks. In return, Yusuf allowed Castilian merchants to bypass costly Venetian middlemen, trading directly with Granada's gold caravans from Mali. Both kings profited, and both kept the deals secret. Alfonso from his nobles hungry for land, Yusuf from clerics who'd call such pragmatism heresy. The most audacious moment came in 1343, when Alfonso besieged Algeciras, a strategic port held by the Marinids. Granada's army arrived, not to fight Castile, but to join them. For months, Muslim sappers and Christian crossbowmen worked side by side, breaching walls while their kings exchanged gifts. Alfonso sent Yusuf a jeweled sword. Yusuf reciprocated with silks embroidered with verses from the Bible Psalms. When the city fell, they staged a mock battle for their chronicler's benefit, then split the spoils off record. Yet such arrangements always walked a knife's edge. In 1354, Yusuf's successor Muhammad V faced rebellion from his own courtiers, who uncovered his Castilian correspondence. Forced to flee, he didn't seek refuge in Muslim Cairo or Fez. He rode straight to King Pedro's court in Seville, where he lived as an honored guest for 2 years while Pedro's armies helped reclaim his throne. The price: Granada became Castile's unofficial vassal, its emirs paying tribute disguised as gifts to avoid scandal. These backroom bargains left lasting marks on Iberian culture. Granada's Alhambra Palace, that jewel of Islamic art, was partly funded by Castilian silver. Its walls bear Christian masons' marks hidden beneath arabesques. Meanwhile, Seville's cathedral rose with techniques borrowed from Granada's architects, its Gothic vaults whispering of collaboration beneath the era's rhetoric of holy war. The real Reconquista wasn't a straight line from conquest to conversion, but a tangled dance where rivals could be patrons, enemies could be saviors, and the quiet deals made in torchlit chambers often mattered more than the battles shouted about in chronicles. The Alpine passes of Switzerland in the early 1500s should have been choked with the smoke of rebellion after all. These mountain valleys had spent generations spilling blood to break free from Habsburg rule. Yet there, marching under the same double-headed eagle banner they'd once burned in effigy, were Swiss pikemen in tight formation, their weapons polished not for liberation but for hire. How did the very men who'd fought for independence at Morgarten and Sempach become the Habsburgs' most feared mercenaries? The answer lies not in battlefields but in ledger books, where the weight of silver could bend even the stiffest pride. For the Swiss, war had become a commodity. Their revolutionary infantry tactics, tight squares of pikes that could shatter knightly charges, made them the most sought-after fighters in Europe. French kings, Italian dukes, even the Pope himself queued up to pay top coin for their services. But the Habsburgs offered something more valuable than wages: access. Control the Alpine passes, and you controlled the flow of goods between Germany and Italy, a trade route where Swiss towns could tax every cart of Flemish wool or Venetian glass. The same mountains that had shielded their rebellion now became toll booths, and suddenly, doing business with former oppressors didn't seem so unthinkable. The arrangement worked because both sides played their parts perfectly. Habsburg paymasters never mentioned old grudges, and Swiss recruiters carefully avoided asking where the silver was mined. In the cantons, young men who'd grown up on tales of Habsburg tyranny now saw imperial service as a career path, a chance to return home with enough gold to buy farmland or a guild membership. Even the legendary William Tell's descendants signed up, proving that time and money could blur even the sharpest lines of enmity. But the real genius of this pact lay in its flexibility. When Swiss and Habsburg interests aligned, like against the Duchy of Burgundy in 1476, their combined forces were unstoppable. When they didn't, the mercenaries simply stayed home. No oaths of fealty, no tangled vassalage, just clean contracts with exit clauses. It was feudalism's antithesis, loyalty measured in monthly installments. The irony: this mercenary partnership inadvertently preserved Swiss independence. By making themselves indispensable to the Habsburg war machine, the cantons ensured Vienna would never risk crushing them completely. Why annihilate a people when you could rent their soldiers instead? The same pikes that had won freedom now secured it through cold, calculated profit, proving that in the calculus of power, shared greed could be stronger than old grievances. And so, beneath the banners of their former enemies, Swiss fighters marched not as subjects, but as shareholders in an empire they'd once vowed to destroy. The Adriatic shimmered with treachery in 1453, or so it seemed to the rest of Christendom. Venice, the republic that had financed crusades and built its fortune on holy wars, now watched silently as Ottoman cannons shattered the walls of Constantinople. But while other European powers gasped in horror, Venetian merchants were already recalculating. Their galleys, laden with spices and silks, continued to dock at Ottoman ports as if nothing had changed. This wasn't betrayal, it was business, and Venice had always known the difference. The relationship between the Serene Republic and the rising Ottoman Empire defied every medieval convention. These weren't just trading partners, they were co-conspirators in a commercial revolution. When Sultan Mehmed II demanded Venetian glassmakers teach his artisans their secrets, Venice sent its best not as prisoners but as paid consultants. When Ottoman armies needed naval supplies for their Black Sea campaigns, Venetian warehouses in Constantinople miraculously stayed open. In return, the Sultan granted Venice exclusive trading rights in key ports, undercutting rivals like Genoa. The arrangement was so brazen that the Vatican threatened to excommunicate the entire Venetian Senate until it became clear those same Venetian gold florins were funding the Pope's own palace renovations. What made this partnership truly remarkable was its layered hypocrisy. Venetian diplomats attended Mass in Constantinople's surviving churches by morning, then dined with Ottoman viziers by night, toasting with wine both sides pretended wasn't forbidden by Islamic law. Their contracts, written in flawless Arabic and Italian, included clauses ensuring Venetian merchants could observe Christian holidays while conveniently omitting any mention of the slaves those same merchants sold to Ottoman buyers. This wasn't just tolerance, it was transactional coexistence perfected to an art form. The pinnacle of their cooperation came in 1500, when Venice helped the Ottomans crush a rival Turkish fleet using cannons cast in Venetian foundries. Imagine the scene: Christian sailors loading weapons marked with the Lion of St. Mark onto Muslim ships, then cheering as those same guns sank their co-religionists from Genoa. Back home, Venetian priests preached against the infidel threat, while the Doge's treasury counted profits from that very threat's expansion. Yet this alliance wasn't without its limits. When Cyprus, Venice's prized colony, fell to the Ottomans in 1571, the Republic finally drew its sword, but even then, the war felt more like a lover's quarrel than a holy crusade. Peace negotiations reopened trade within months, and by 1573, Venetian merchants were back in Istanbul's markets, haggling over pepper prices as if the fighting had been a minor misunderstanding. The lesson here isn't just about greed overcoming faith, it's about how trade routes redraw moral boundaries. Venice proved that in the medieval Mediterranean, spices flowed where swords could not, and that the surest way to build bridges between civilizations wasn't through shared gods but shared ledgers. Their story whispers an uncomfortable truth, that the ties binding merchant to merchant often proved stronger than those binding believer to believer, and that sometimes the most enduring peace treaties were written not in scripture but in accounting books. Bitter Nordic winds howled through the streets of Kalmar in June 1397, but the chill inside the castle was nothing compared to the frosty silence between the three crowns gathered there. Denmark's Queen Margaret had summoned Norway and Sweden's nobles not with swords but with parchment, and the document they signed that day would bind their kingdoms for generations. The Kalmar Union wasn't born from shared dreams or cultural kinship. It was a masterclass in political theater, where reluctant players took the stage because the alternative, facing German Hanseatic merchants or resurgent Baltic powers alone, was unthinkable. Margaret's genius lay in her understanding of Scandinavian fears. Norway, its population decimated by the Black Death, clung to its overseas territories like Greenland and Iceland but lacked the ships to defend them. Sweden's iron and copper mines made it wealthy, yet its nobles squabbled endlessly over the throne, and Denmark, it had the strongest navy but needed Sweden's resources and Norway's Atlantic footholds to counter the Hanseatic League's stranglehold on trade. The union's terms seemed simple: one monarch ruling all three realms, with each keeping its own laws and customs. But beneath that delicate balance simmered tensions that would never fully fade. For a time, the arrangement worked brilliantly. Margaret's adopted heir, Eric of Pomerania, presided over a Nordic bloc that commanded the Baltic. When pirates threatened Norwegian shipping, Danish warships cleared the seas. Swedish miners found new markets for their metal in Copenhagen's bustling ports. Even Iceland, which had languished under Norwegian neglect, saw renewed interest as Danish merchants realized its value for cod fisheries. The unions combined might force the Hanseatic League to renegotiate tolls, proving that unity, however fragile, could bend even the mightiest commercial powers. Yet the cracks appeared almost immediately. Sweden's iron-rich provinces chafed under Danish taxes, while Norway's distant territories felt increasingly like colonial afterthoughts. The Union's fatal flaw was its insistence on a single monarch, because when that ruler happened to be as tone-deaf as King Christian II, disaster followed. His brutal massacre of Swedish nobles in Stockholm in 1520, known as the Bloodbath, wasn't just a crime, it was the Union's death knell. Gustav Vasa's subsequent rebellion didn't just win Sweden's independence, it exposed the truth that Scandinavia's unity had always been a forced marriage, not a love match. What's fascinating, though, is how long the illusion held. Norway remained yoked to Denmark until 1814, their shared laws and language leaving traces still visible today. And the Union's ghost haunted Nordic politics for centuries. When Sweden and Denmark went to war in the 1600s, they weren't just fighting over territory, they were settling old scores from Kalmar's collapse. Even now, the Nordic Council's cooperative spirit owes something to Margaret's original vision, proving that while imposed unity rarely lasts, its echoes can shape history long after the documents fade. The Kalmar Union taught Scandinavia a paradoxical lesson, that alliances forged in necessity might bend and crack, but the marks they leave are indelible. The Irish Sea had never seemed so narrow as in the late 12th century, when Welsh princes stared across its choppy waters toward an unlikely salvation. Their mountain strongholds, from Snowdonia to the Brecon Beacons, were under relentless pressure from English crown forces, the same Anglo-Norman knights who had already subjugated much of southern Wales. But on the western horizon lay a people who understood their plight like no other, the Irish clans, fellow Celts fighting their own brutal war against Norman invaders. What followed wasn't just a military alliance, it was a rediscovery of ancient bonds that geography and time had frayed but never broken. Take the story of Lord Rhys ap Griffith, the Welsh ruler of Deheubarth. By 1171, his kingdom was squeezed between English castles and rival Welsh princes. Desperate for reinforcements, he turned to Diarmait mac Murchada, the exiled Irish king of Leinster. The connection wasn't random. Centuries earlier, Irish settlers had founded Welsh dynasties like the Deisi, and the old tales spoke of heroes like Bran the Blessed sailing between these lands. Now that mythological kinship became political reality, Irish Galloglass warriors, mercenaries armed with deadly two-handed axes, began appearing in Welsh campaigns, their distinctive padded armor striking fear into Norman ranks. The cooperation went deeper than hired swords. Welsh bards traveled to Irish courts, swapping stories that reinforced a shared identity as peoples of the Celtic fringe. Irish monks in Wales copied manuscripts comparing Norman expansion to the biblical plague of locusts, framing resistance as sacred duty. Even the landscape played its part. Welsh princes adopted Irish-style ring forts for their strongholds, while Irish chieftains studied Welsh longbow tactics to counter Norman cavalry. Yet the alliance's most enduring impact was psychological. When Llewellyn the Great rose to power in Gwynedd in the early 13th century, he didn't just recruit Irish fighters, he styled himself as a pan-Celtic leader. His court welcomed exiled Irish princes, and his diplomats brokered marriages between Welsh and Gaelic noble families. The message was clear: Celtic solidarity could be a bulwark against English cultural domination. The bitter irony, just as Wales and Ireland found common cause, fate intervened. The Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169 diverted Irish resources, while England's King John exploited Welsh divisions. By 1282, Llewellyn's grandson would die in a skirmish near Bilthwells, his dreams of Celtic unity buried beneath English castles. But the brief flame of Welsh-Irish cooperation left its mark, proof that even in defeat, the bonds of language, legend, and shared struggle could briefly rewrite the rules of medieval geopolitics. The docks of Caffa in the 1300s presented a sight that would baffle most medieval Europeans. Genoese merchants in their distinctive red cloaks, haggling with Tatar horsemen over bolts of Chinese silk, while Mongol officials stamped ledgers in Italian alongside traders speaking a dozen languages. This wasn't just a marketplace, it was the beating heart of one of history's most improbable partnerships. The Republic of Genoa, a maritime power built on banking and naval prowess, had somehow become the Golden Horde's favored trading partner, their colonies dotting the Black Sea coast like pearls on a string. What could possibly unite Italian city dwellers and nomadic steppe warriors? The answer lay not in shared customs or faith, but in something far more universal: the irresistible pull of profit. For the Mongols, inheritors of Genghis Khan's vast empire, the arrangement solved a problem. They controlled the world's greatest land routes, but their strength lay in cavalry, not ships. Enter the Genoese master navigators with a fleet that could connect Mongol-ruled Crimea to markets from London to Alexandria. The deal they struck was brutally simple. The Horde provided security and access to overland trade networks, while Genoa handled shipping, turning Black Sea ports into bustling hubs where Persian spices met Flemish wool. The Mongol capital at Sarai even had its own Genoese quarter, where accountants tracked transactions using Arabic numerals, a novelty in Europe at the time. The scale of this exchange was staggering. Caravans arriving from the Silk Road would unload in Caffa, where Genoese galleys waited to carry goods westward. In return, European silver flowed east, minted into coins that funded the Horde's armies. But the trade wasn't just in goods, it was in knowledge. Genoese cartographers created maps of Asia based on Mongol intelligence, while Tatar diplomats learned enough Ligurian dialect to negotiate contracts. The Mongols, often portrayed as destroyers, became unlikely patrons of globalization, protecting trade routes that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Pacific. Yet this golden age carried dark undercurrents. The same ships that carried silk and spices also transported slaves, mostly young men and women from the Caucasus, sold in markets from Cairo to Genoa. And the alliance's greatest strength, its interdependence, became its fatal flaw. When the Black Death erupted in the 1340s, it likely entered Europe through Caffa, carried by flea-infested rats on Genoese vessels. The Mongols, accusing the Italians of spreading disease, besieged the city in 1346, catapulting plague-ridden corpses over the walls in one of history's first recorded instances of biological warfare. The final irony: even devastation couldn't sever these ties. Within years, trade resumed, and Genoese notaries were again recording deals in the Crimea. But the balance had shifted. As the Golden Horde fragmented, Genoa's colonies became vulnerable to new powers like the Ottomans. By the 15th century, the last Italian merchants boarded ships for home, leaving behind crumbling warehouses where Mongol and Latin inscriptions still mingled on the walls. Their legacy wasn't just in the silks that revolutionized European fashion or the accounting methods that predated modern finance. It was in the proof that even the most divergent cultures could build something extraordinary when mutual interest overcame mutual suspicion. The real treasure of this alliance wasn't the gold or the spices. It was the blueprint it left for how commerce, not conquest, could redraw the map of human connection. The Pyrenees Mountains in the early 13th century hid more than just rugged peaks. They concealed a desperate refuge for Europe's most hunted heretics. The Cathars, branded as enemies of Christendom for their rejection of church doctrine, had seen their strongholds in Languedoc reduced to smoldering ruins by the Albigensian Crusade. Yet as papal armies swept through southern France with fire and sword, an unlikely sanctuary emerged just across the border, the Kingdom of Aragon, where King Peter II made a choice that would defy Rome and reshape the fate of his realm. Peter wasn't a Cathar sympathizer, he was a crowned monarch who'd fought Muslims at the Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa, earning the church's praise, but politics, as always, had its own logic. The Cathar nobility of Languedoc included powerful vassals whose lands bordered Aragon, and their defeat would leave Peter's northern flank exposed to French expansion. Worse, the Crusades' leader, Simon de Montfort, had ambitions that stretched far beyond eradicating heresy. He eyed the Pyrenean passes that controlled trade between Iberia and Europe. So Peter did the unthinkable. He offered protection to Cathar lords, welcoming them into his court and even arranging marriages between Aragonese nobles and Occitan heretics. This wasn't mere tolerance, it was a calculated gamble. By sheltering the Cathars, Peter positioned himself as the defender of Occitan culture against French aggression, winning the loyalty of wealthy towns like Toulouse. Aragonese knights, many of whom had fought alongside Cathar lords against Muslim armies, saw no contradiction in shielding them now. The king's court in Zaragoza became a surreal mix of Orthodox bishops and Cathar perfectly holy men who preached a faith Rome condemned as satanic. For a brief, extraordinary moment, a Christian king had turned his realm into a haven for heretics, proving that medieval alliances could bend even the strictest religious boundaries. The breaking point came at Muret in 1213. Peter, leading a combined force of Aragonese and Occitan Cathars, faced de Montfort's Crusaders outside Toulouse. What followed was less a battle than a massacre. Peter, overconfident and outmaneuvered, charged headlong into a trap and was cut down by French knights. His death didn't just doom the Cathars, it shattered Aragon's dream of dominating Languedoc. Within years, the Inquisition would root out the last Cathar communities, their manuscripts burned and their leaders executed. Yet the legacy of this doomed pact lingers in unexpected ways. Aragonese archives reveal that Peter's successors quietly continued sheltering Cathar families long after Muret, disguising them as loyal Catholics while their beliefs survived in secret. Some historians argue this culture of clandestine resistance paved the way for Aragon's later tolerance of Jews and Muslims, making it one of medieval Europe's most religiously diverse kingdoms. The Cathars themselves vanished, but their brief alliance with Aragon left a ghostly imprint, a reminder that even the most persecuted groups could find shelter in the shadow of a crown, if only for a moment before the tides of orthodoxy swept them away. The smoke had barely cleared from the fields of Lipany in 1434 when Emperor Sigismund did something that stunned all of Christendom. He extended a hand not to crush the Hussite rebels but to bargain with them. For 15 brutal years, his crusades had failed to break these defiant Czech reformers, whose war wagons and peasant armies humiliated knightly forces at battles like Žižkov's famous stand at Kutná Hora. Yet now, with both sides exhausted and Bohemia reduced to scorched earth, the emperor who had once ordered Jan Hus burned at the stake conceded something remarkable. Heresy couldn't be eradicated by sword alone. What changed? The answer lies in the sheer resilience of the Hussite cause. Unlike other medieval reform movements stamped out by papal armies, the Hussites had turned their persecution into a national awakening. Farmers welded old plowshares into deadly flails, priests doubled as military strategists, and their makeshift fortresses withstood sieges that would have broken professional armies. More importantly, they weren't just fighting for theology, they were defending a Czech identity that saw Rome's authority as foreign oppression. Sigismund, despite his title as King of Bohemia, was an outsider to these people, a German-speaking Habsburg who'd inherited the throne but never their loyalty. The terms of the Compactata of Basel in 1436 read like a medieval miracle. Hussite priests could preach in Czech, not Latin. Laypeople could receive both bread and wine at communion, a symbolic rejection of clerical privilege. Most shockingly, Sigismund allowed Hussite nobles to keep church lands they'd seized, effectively legalizing a parallel religious authority within his empire. For a ruler who'd spent decades posing as Christendom's defender, these concessions were tantamount to admitting defeat, yet they saved his crown. By conceding where he couldn't conquer, Sigismund finally gained entry to Prague in 1436, where a wary populace watched their archenemy kneel at the same altars his Crusaders had tried to destroy. The real lesson here isn't just about religious tolerance, it's about the limits of imperial power. The Holy Roman Empire, for all its grandeur, depended on local nobles' cooperation. Sigismund's predecessors had crushed smaller heresies easily, but the Hussites proved that a movement rooted in national consciousness could outlast even the mightiest armies. His compromise set a precedent that would echo through the Reformation a century later, when Protestant princes cited the Hussite example to negotiate similar freedoms. Yet the bittersweet irony, just months after his coronation, Sigismund died, leaving behind a Bohemia still deeply divided. The Utraquist Hussites who'd accepted the compromise soon found themselves battling more radical factions, proving that peace bought with parchment could be as fragile as any battlefield truce. But for that brief moment in Basel, Europe glimpsed an alternative to the medieval cycle of holy war, one where even an emperor, when faced with indomitable conviction, could choose pragmatism over pride. It was a lesson the continent would spend the next 2 centuries struggling to relearn. The rolling plains of Hungary in the early 16th century should have been a bulwark against Ottoman expansion, yet in the shadows of Buda's royal palace, a shocking sight unfolded. Hungarian magnates, their cloaks embroidered with crosses, sat across from elite janissaries, the very slave soldiers who had terrorized Christian borders for generations. These weren't prisoners or defectors, they were hired blades paid with Hungarian gold to turn their scimitars against other Hungarians. How did Europe's shield against Islam become a client of its greatest enemy? The answer lies in a civil war so vicious that nobles were willing to bargain with the devil himself and pay the price for generations. At the heart of this recklessness stood 2 rival claimants to Hungary's throne, John Zápolya and Ferdinand of Habsburg. Zápolya, voivode of Transylvania, represented Hungarian nobles wary of Habsburg domination, while Ferdinand brought the might of the Holy Roman Empire. When their struggle reached stalemate in 1526, Zápolya made a decision that would haunt his legacy. He dispatched envoys to Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, offering vassalage in exchange for military support. The Ottomans, sensing an opportunity to weaken Christendom from within, didn't just send troops, they sent their finest. Janissaries, the disciplined corps of slave soldiers raised from Christian boys, now returning to fight for a Christian king. The immediate impact was devastatingly effective. Janissary arquebusiers shattered Ferdinand's mercenary lines at the Battle of Tarkel in 1527, their volleys cutting down Austrian pikemen with terrifying precision. For Zápolya's supporters, this seemed like salvation until they noticed the Ottoman engineers accompanying the Janissaries, sketching Hungarian fortifications with unsettling diligence. These weren't just mercenaries, they were scouts studying the very defenses they might one day need to breach. What began as a tactical alliance soon spiraled into dependence. By 1538, Zapolia's widow Isabella relied so heavily on Ottoman garrisons that Hungarian nobles complained their capital resembled an Ottoman outpost. Janissaries patrolled Buda's streets, their tall balk hats casting shadows over churches, while local merchants learned enough Turkish to haggle with their new overlords. The bitter irony, many Janissaries stationed there were likely of Balkan origin, men who might have once been taken from Christian villages not unlike those now under their watch. The long-term consequences were catastrophic. When Suleiman finally invaded in 1541, claiming Hungary as a protectorate, former Janissary allies became occupiers. Castles that had hosted Ottoman troops as guests now fell with ease, their weaknesses memorized years earlier. The lesson was brutal but clear. In medieval geopolitics, renting the wolf's teeth might win a battle, but it guaranteed you'd be the next meal. Hungary's partition into Habsburg and Ottoman spheres for the next century wasn't just the result of invasion. It was the inevitable outcome of an alliance that mistook desperation for strategy. The waters off Cyprus in the late 1400s were a pirate's paradise, Christian corsairs preying on Muslim pilgrim ships, Berber raiders snatching Venetian merchants, and renegade captains who owed allegiance to no flag but their own. For King James II of Cyprus, this lawless chaos wasn't just a nuisance, it was an existential threat. His kingdom, a fragile remnant of Crusader glory, depended on trade, and every plundered vessel meant empty harbors and dwindling coffers. But the solution he devised would have made his Crusader ancestors spin in their tombs: an alliance with the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, the very power that had once driven the Latin Christians from Jerusalem. This was no symbolic handshake. The pact signed in 1487 created joint naval patrols where Cypriot galleys sailed alongside Mamluk warships, their crews communicating through a pidgin of Arabic, Greek, and Italian. When pirates were caught, whether Christian or Muslim, they faced swift justice in whichever port was nearest, their executions a grim warning to others. The agreement even included profit sharing from recovered loot, turning former adversaries into business partners. For the Mamluks, the calculus was simple. Pilgrim traffic to Mecca was their lifeblood, and Cyprus controlled key sea lanes. Better to deal with a weakened Christian king than risk chaos that might tempt Ottoman interference. The alliance's unlikeliest moment came in 1490, when a combined fleet cornered the infamous corsair Kemal Rise off Crete. A renegade Ottoman captain who had terrorized both Christian and Muslim shipping, Rise found himself trapped between Cypriot carracks and Mamluk galleys, a sight so surreal that contemporary chroniclers insisted God must have blinded the pirates to their own enmity. The battle ended with Rise's ship in flames and his survivors paraded through Famagusta in chains, a spectacle designed to prove that even bitter rivals could unite against a common scourge. Yet this cooperation had limits neither side dared acknowledge. The same Cypriot nobles who cheered pirate hangings also sold timber to Ottoman shipyards, undermining Mamluk security. Meanwhile, Mamluk officials turned a blind eye to Egyptian grain smugglers who supplied Cypriot cities during droughts. Hypocrisy, it seemed, was the grease that kept the machinery of this alliance running. When Venice eventually absorbed Cyprus in 1489, the Mamluks didn't protest, they simply renegotiated the pirate hunting accord with the new Venetian rulers. The lesson was clear: in the Mediterranean's cutthroat waters, shared interests could trump centuries of holy war. Cyprus and the Mamluks proved that even the deepest divides could be bridged, not by lofty ideals, but by the pragmatic recognition that some threats make strange bedfellows, and that gold, whether from trade or recovered plunder, shines the same in any faith's treasury. The coastal winds of Brittany carried more than salt and seabirds. They bore the whispers of defiance, a stubborn refusal to bend to Parisian will. For centuries, this rugged peninsula jutting into the Atlantic had been a realm apart, where Celtic dialects mingled with French and where dukes ruled with the swagger of kings. But when Capetian monarchs began tightening their grip in the 12th century, Brittany's rulers faced a dilemma: submit to French overlordship or seek an ally across the Channel. Their choice would turn this wedge of land into a political battleground, where English gold and Breton pride forged one of medieval Europe's most enduring resistance movements. Take Duke John III, who in 1341 did the unthinkable. He invited English garrisons into Breton ports like Brest and Vannes. To outsiders, this seemed like treason. Brittany was, after all, a French fief in name, but John understood the delicate dance of medieval sovereignty. By playing England against France, he transformed his duchy from a vassal state into a pivot point of the 100 Years' War. The English, desperate for footholds on the continent, poured money and men into fortifying Breton towns. In return, Brittany's famed archers, whose skills rivaled even Wales, fought alongside English armies at Crécy and Poitiers. What made this alliance so resilient wasn't just military convenience, but cultural nuance. Brittany's elite spoke French and intermarried with Norman nobility, yet commoners clung to Breton traditions that reached back to their ancestors' flight from Anglo-Saxon Britain centuries earlier. When English commanders arrived, they didn't impose foreign rule. They positioned themselves as protectors of Breton autonomy. Edward III even issued charters in both French and Breton, a shrewd nod to local identity that French kings, insisting on Parisian supremacy, often neglected. The drama reached its peak during the War of the Breton Succession, 1341 to 1365, a chaotic struggle where rival dukes became proxies for England and France. At the Battle of Auray in 1364, English-backed John of Montfort crushed French-supported Charles of Blois, sealing Brittany's orientation toward London. Yet the victor's first act wasn't to declare independence. It was to swear a carefully worded oath to the French crown that preserved Breton self-rule in all but name. This balancing act became Brittany's signature, publicly acknowledging Paris while privately dealing with Westminster. Trade sealed the pact. Breton linen and salt flowed into English ports while Cornish tin, vital for bronze, moved in the opposite direction. The duchy's shipbuilders, renowned for their sturdy caravels, constructed vessels for both merchants and navies, creating a maritime economy too valuable for either kingdom to disrupt. Even during truces between England and France, Breton captains continued their cross-channel runs, proving that commerce could bypass royal animosities. The final irony: Brittany's independence outlasted England's continental ambitions. When the 100 Years' War ended in 1453, Calais fell, but Brittany remained autonomous for another 4 decades until a fateful royal marriage in 1491 finally bound it to France. Yet traces of the English connection lingered. Breton sailors still crewed Tudor ships, and the duchy's distinctive striped sails remained a common sight in London's docks. Those centuries of calculated defiance left an indelible mark, proving that in medieval geopolitics, the smallest players could wield outsized influence if they knew how to play both sides against the middle. The dusty plains of Valencia in 1195 bore witness to a scene that defied all expectations of Holy War Aragonese knights, their surcoats emblazoned with the red and gold bars of their kingdom, standing idle as Almohad cavalry paraded past without drawing a blade. This wasn't a truce born of weakness, but of cold-eyed strategy. The same King Alfonso II, who had spent years battling Muslim rulers, now exchanged envoys with the Almohad Caliph Abu Yusuf Yaqub. their letters sealed with wax instead of blood. For these bitter rivals, the calculus was simple. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy isn't just your friend, they're your temporary lifeline. What could possibly make Crusaders and jihadists lower their banners? The answer lay in the tangled web of Iberian politics. While the Almohads faced rebellions in North Africa, Aragon was locked in a power struggle with the Count of Toulouse over Provence. Neither could afford war on two fronts. Their solution was as pragmatic as it was unorthodox: a series of time-bound treaties called hudnas, Islamic legal concepts that allowed for temporary truces without abandoning the larger holy war. Under these agreements, Aragonese merchants could trade in Almohad ports like Denia, while Almohad scholars traveled safely to Christian-held Tortosa to study ancient Greek texts in its famed translation houses. The most striking example came in 1210, when King Peter II of Aragon, later hailed as the Catholic for his role in the Battle of Los Navas de Tolosa, paused his campaigns against the Almohads entirely. Why? Because his rival, the Christian king of Navarre, was threatening Aragonese borders. Peter even allowed Almohad troops to cross his territory to attack Castilian positions, proving that faith took a backseat to feudal advantage. The Almohads, for their part, turned a blind eye when Aragonese mercenaries hired Berber deserters to fight in Italian wars. This calculated coexistence left cultural fingerprints that still resonate today. The Liber del Consolat de Mar, a maritime legal code developed in 13th century Valencia, borrowed heavily from Almohad commercial laws, proof that even wartime enemies could share practical wisdom. Aragonese castle architecture suddenly featured Atalaya's watchtowers modeled after Almohad designs, while Valencian irrigation systems retained Arabic place names like Acequia centuries after the Reconquista. Yet these truces were always walking a tightrope. When the papacy demanded crusade taxes from Aragon, its kings would stage token raids on Muslim border towns, just enough to satisfy Rome while avoiding full-scale war. The Almohads played similar games, proclaiming jihad in their mosques while quietly extending trade permits to Christian merchants. Both sides understood the rules: perform enough public hostility to placate hardliners, but keep the back channels open. The final irony: these pauses in holy war may have prolonged the Reconquista by centuries. Without constant pressure, the Almohad regime stabilized enough to delay Christian advances until the pivotal Los Navas de Tolosa in 1212, where Peter II finally broke ranks with his former tacit allies. That battle's aftermath revealed the true cost of these alliances. When Aragonese troops sacked Muslim cities they'd once traded with, they found walls reinforced with knowledge gained during peacetime exchanges. Even the swords they faced were forged with techniques Christian smiths had learned from Almohad artisans. This dance of conflict and coexistence teaches us that medieval holy wars were never just about religion. They were chess games where kings and caliphs moved bishops and knights across a board much larger than faith alone. The Aragonese Almohad truces proved that shared interests could build bridges even across the deepest ideological divides, bridges strong enough to bear the weight of commerce, culture, and clandestine deals, if only until the next war drum sounded. The wind howling across the eastern Polish steppes carried more than just the scent of wild thyme. It bore the rhythmic drumming of hooves that could mean salvation or slaughter. By the 16th century, Polish nobles had learned a hard truth. The same Tatar horsemen who burned their villages in lightning raids could also be the sharpest weapon in their arsenal. This paradox became Poland's military masterstroke, turning feared adversaries into elite cavalry units known as the Lipka Tatars. Their story isn't just about mercenaries for hire, it's a lesson in how necessity can rewrite the rules of loyalty. King Stephen Bathory saw their potential first. Facing Muscovy's expanding might in the 1570s, he needed mobile forces to patrol Poland's vast eastern frontier. The Tatars, raised on horseback almost before they could walk, could cover 60 miles in a day, twice the speed of Polish hussars. Their composite bows outranged early firearms, and their feigned retreat tactics had shattered European armies for centuries. So Bathory made them an offer: land grants near Trakai in exchange for military service. The catch: these weren't just any Tatars. They were descendants of the Golden Horde, the same warriors who had once reduced Krakow to ashes. The Lipka units quickly proved their worth at battles like Byzina in 1588, where their swirling attacks disrupted enemy lines before the Polish heavy cavalry delivered the killing blow. But what's truly fascinating is how this military arrangement blossomed into cultural exchange. Tatar troopers retained their Islamic faith, a rarity in Catholic Poland, and built wooden mosques with peaked roofs that blended seamlessly into the Lithuanian countryside. Their officers received noble status, intermarrying with Polish Szlachta families, while still maintaining distinct traditions like ceremonial sabers engraved with Quranic verses. This alliance faced its ultimate test during the Khmelnytsky uprising in the 1640s. When Cossack rebels turned on Poland, they expected the Tatars to join their revolt against Catholic rule. Instead, the Lipka regiment stood firm beside the Polish crown, their loyalty cemented by decades of land rights and religious tolerance. That decision likely saved the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from collapse, buying critical time to regroup against the Cossack threat. Yet the partnership wasn't without its ironies. While Lipka Tatars guarded Poland's borders, their Crimean cousins continued raiding Polish villages, a duality that forced Warsaw into diplomatic gymnastics. Diplomatic envoys would protest Tatar raids in one breath, then toast their Lipka commanders in the next. The Tatars themselves navigated this split identity with pragmatism, adopting Polish heraldry for official documents while keeping saddlebags filled with kumis, the fermented mare's milk of their ancestors. The legacy of this experiment endures in Poland's military DNA. Long after firearms made bows obsolete, Tatar descendants formed reconnaissance units in the interwar period, their knowledge of eastern terrains proving invaluable. Today, the wooden mosques of villages like Krasnini still stand architectural testaments to a time when shared battlefields could bridge divides deeper than faith or blood. The Lipka story reminds us that the most enduring alliances aren't always built on trust, but on the mutual understanding that some enemies are worse than uneasy friends, and that the right partnership can turn yesterday's nightmare into today's frontline defenders. From battlefield betrayals to trade-driven truces, these 24 alliances shatter the myth of the medieval world as some simplistic age of clashing swords and inflexible loyalties. What appears jarring to modern eyes, Crusaders breaking bread with Muslim emirs, Viking mercenaries guarding French kings, was often just survival wearing the mask of pragmatism. Peel back the gilded edges of illuminated manuscripts, and you'll find rulers who understood a timeless truth: principles rarely fill coffers or stop armies. Consider the sheer audacity of these partnerships. Burgundy's dukes didn't just betray France, they orchestrated its near collapse, all while draping themselves in piety. The Teutonic knights, sworn to eradicate paganism, quietly tolerated Lithuanian rituals when it meant accessing Black Sea trade routes. Even faith, that most unyielding of medieval boundaries, bent under pressure. Witness Aragon's kings sheltering Cathar heretics to counter French influence, or Hungarian nobles hiring Ottoman janissaries to fight Christian rivals. Hypocrisy, perhaps, but also a masterclass in strategic flexibility that would make modern diplomats blush. What these stories reveal isn't just historical trivia, it's a lens for understanding power itself. Alliances weren't sealed because leaders suddenly discovered mutual admiration. They emerged from cold calculations, a Lombard king needing Frankish muscle against Byzantium, a Venetian doge weighing the profits of Ottoman trade against Papal wrath. The real surprise isn't that these pacts existed, but how often their unintended consequences outlasted them. The Hanseatic League's mercantile empire reshaped Baltic identities. The old alliance's cultural echoes linger in Scottish wine cellars and legal codes. Even failed coalitions like the Hussites' brief pact with Poland planted seeds of tolerance, nationalism, military innovation that bloomed centuries later. So the next time you picture the medieval world, ditch the fairy tale binaries of knights versus infidels or crowns versus rebels. Instead, imagine a chessboard where every piece had its price, and the boldest players knew when to let an enemy check their opponent's king. That's the real lesson humming beneath these 24 stories. History's most fascinating turns often happen not in the spotlight of battle, but in the shadowed corners where rivals become temporary co-conspirators. Now it's your turn. Which of these improbable alliances left you rethinking everything you knew about the Middle Ages? Share your picks below, and for more journeys into history's hidden backrooms, hit that subscribe button. The past has plenty more surprises